lots of friends. I'm delighted to be here, to be in Salisbury Theater. When I was in Fairbanks at the University of Alaska, that was before we had separate campuses in Alaska, Lee was a good friend of mine, and I've known him since 1955 when I was here for the Institutional Convention. And we had a house on campus and in the early 1970s, and one night there was some kind of a French club performance, and my friend George Rogers was up from Juneau, and various other friends had been invited up to the house, and Lee Salisbury was there. And at one point I came into the kitchen carrying a bunch of glasses, and Lee was speaking in French with George Rogers, and as I walked in, I said, oh, and sort of responded to something they were saying. I said, oh, may we, and Lee said, oh, you speak French? And I said, oh, yes, I studied under Michel Foucault. And he said, oh, so did I. And then we conversed a little bit, and he said, what school did you go to? I said, Stuyvesant High School. And he said, so did I. And then he said, where do you live? And when did you live? And I said, I lived on Charles Street. And he said, so did I. And I said, I'm 8 Charles Street. And he said, so did I. And it turned out that Lee and I had gone to Stuyvesant High School in 1941-42. I lived in a rented room while I was in high school in a private apartment, and Lee lived in the floor above me at the same time. He was 2 years behind me in Stuyvesant High School. So I have this real connection here. And I don't even remember if Charles would know whether I told the story in the book. But see, one of the things Charles and I did, and this book would never have been without Charles, but Charles was a strong taskmaster, and he kept excising stuff from my narratives. And he said, oh, you can't interrupt the flow of the stories, the side sub-stories. You've got to keep going in the book. And we had a real partnership going. And I would like to start by having Charles talk to you about how we sort of worked together and created the book, because Charles had experience with a book process that you might call as told to. And he worked with Wally Hickel, he did Dave Rose's memoir on being the first director of the Alaska Permanent Fund, and lots of good stories. And so he had this process very well in hand. And he was a tough taskmaster in terms of moving along and getting things done. And I'll turn it over to Charles, and then I'll come back. So yours, please.
Thanks, Nick. It's obviously a great honor to share the stage with Nick. I was just thinking that, where's the Nick Fisher auditorium? I think we need to rectify that. And this story that he told about the coincidence of the person that who this theater is named, living in the apartment above him when he was a child, is kind of the story that I got used to as we were working on this book, because if you remember the movie Zelig, the Woody Allen movie, where the character shows up at all these different historical moments, it was very much like that. And after a while, I would shake my hands and say, wait a minute, you could have been involved in that too, you know. And as you read the book, I think that comes through a little bit of just the extraordinary breadth of Vic's life and all of the things that he got involved in, which have all of these, you know, it's almost as if he's lived 3 or 4 lives, certainly lived 3 or 4 times as much as most people have. It was very fortuitous for me to be invited to be part of this project. And I've known who Vic was since I was a kid, of course, because he's always been involved in public life and but I did not know all of the things that he had done. And I knew he was a likable person and a fun person to run into at a party, but that was more or less the extent of it. He contacted me because he'd read the book that I did about Dave Rose, and he was interested sort of in the editor and how would that work to work with his materials to help him get it into shape for a book. And he'd been thinking about doing the book for a long time and had done a few little pieces of writing but hadn't really gotten very far. And as we were talking about it, and I described the process I used with Governor Hickel and with Dave Rose, he and Jane got kind of interested in this other approach, which is more than being an editor, but actually being someone pulling the content out of the subject and sort of helping get it onto the page. And so I kind of learned to do this sort of by trial and error and working with Governor Hickel. And the idea is first to do sort of an overview set of interviews to figure out, okay, what is this book about? What is the sort of the general outline of it, and what is it that the person wants to say? What's their main message? And from that, I would develop an outline, you know, a chapter by chapter outline of what each chapter would be about and what the sort of general topics would be. Then work with the author to determine, okay, is that what you want to do? And once that's determined, then we have a game plan for working through the material. Because essentially what you're trying to do is work with someone to download their entire life. And if you do it in an unorganized way, it would just take forever. You can't, and then you have all this amorphous material and you have to try to fit it together somehow. So as a writer, as a journalist, I learned a long time ago, it's much better to have an idea of what you're after before you start gathering information. So then we started the introduction, chapter 1, chapter 2, and the interviews to talk about his memories about each of those times and what he experienced. And my questions sometimes would be few and far between, and I just let him talk. And then other times I would say, okay, but tell me what time of year was that? What was the weather like? What were these other people like? You know, what were their names and what were their personalities? And trying to fill in as much detail in the stories as possible. And then we would have those transcribed, and I think we came to 110 or so of those interviews, some of which were several hours long. So a tremendous amount of material. And I went and interviewed other people who had been involved in the same events in Vic's life to try to get other perspectives on the same thing and find out a couple of things. One is, did they remember the same way he did? In oral history, you find that most of our memories are actually recreated in our minds. You don't actually remember what happened. We sort of have little markers in our minds and we bring things back. And it's very possible, and people I've worked with have found, that we create memories that never took place. And so, or we remember them as they get farther in the past, the stories get better. They get sort of shaped into a good narrative. And details are shaved off or annotated. So it's important to go back and verify as much as you can. And then the other thing that would happen is you talk to somebody else, and they would hit you with a great additional detail. So in the Little Man for Stabler movement that Vic was a part of starting, which is a very important part of bringing Alaska Stabler, there was a cocktail party where that sort of thing sort of got started. And I was able to talk to 300 or 400 people who were at that cocktail party, and who said what, and how do they remember it, and that was the Little Man for Stabler was kind of a joke about Roger Primo, who was a rather short attorney from Anchorage. And so you get more of those details, and then you can put them in the story and add to
color and dimension to it. And then the next part is going through the documentary record. And in Vic's case, that was huge. Actually, it was huge for the other two gentlemen I worked with as well. Vic's very illustrious family communicated sometimes several times a week by tracking long letters to each other about all the little details that were happening in their lives. This is before phone communication was really very efficient, so these letters had all of the personal and intimate details that we now share on the phone or by email. And so that was an amazing resource because you could nail down exact dates that things happened, things that you never remember. Gloria Fisher, Vic's first wife, was a writer, a wonderful letter writer, and she fortunately recorded some historical events that were never, to my knowledge, recorded nearly as articulately anywhere else. She had a series of letters she wrote from the Constitutional Convention in which she talked about the social scene. She talked about what people were doing after floor sessions, when they were caucusing in people's hotel rooms, and sort of what they were talking about. Singing sessions that Bill Egan would lead. Apparently his religious memory, he was able to remember all the words of all the old songs, and so we would lead these singing sessions. And one of my favorite parts was her talking about the drafting of the preamble to the Constitution, which was sort of done as legislators often are. Oh, we hate this, let's get together and do something else, and everybody hands copies to Gloria, and she's sort of marking it up, putting it back on the floor, and they vote on it. So that stuff was great. Also, her description of when statehood occurred and the celebration in Anchorage was incredibly vivid, and so we were able to pull on that. And then, Vic's father was a wonderful, illustrious writer. His mother was a writer with great beauty and strength in terms of her descriptions. And so these thousands of pages of letters, which were from archives at Princeton University, where Vic's father's papers were, his mother's papers, also from Vic's papers. Too much to ever go through in every single detail, but we went through a tremendous amount of it and pulled a lot out. And that all, again, it verifies what we've got, and it also adds dimension to it. And so then it's just a matter of, when you got that material, sitting down and writing each chapter. We wrote the first couple of chapters to say, is this how you sound? Is this how you want to be expressing the words? And we marked it up. These sentences are too long. It doesn't sound like me, so that I went back and rewrote it, sort of based on the feedback he'd given me, gave it back to him. And we went through that a couple of times, and so he said, "Yeah, that sounds about right." So then I knew what the tone was, and was able to use that tone in writing all of the chapters of the book. And then we went through a little bit of an iterative process where I'd write the draft, he'd take it, he'd mark it up, I'd go through his markups and make changes. Other friends would read it, other markups would take place, and this went on to the dismay of the University of Alaska Press, and basically until they were ready to put the ink on the press, and we were still changing the page, and at some moment you can't change it anymore, although Vic is still trying. So that's how the process worked, and it was a really rewarding process that took 3 years. I was doing other things at the same time, but this was my primary effort during those 3 years, and I was really, really proud of that and happy with how it came out. One of the things about working with Vic, and I'll turn it back to Vic as you want to hear his stories, was that, as I said, these things kept popping up that I was just amazed to hear about. And one of our early coffees, we were talking about, well, I know all about your Constitutional Convention years, but what about your early years? I don't know much about that. How are we going to connect the later part to the early part? Well, in 1991, I got a letter from an old classmate who had been my classmate in Russia, and we'd been separated by spellman's curve, so I hadn't actually heard from him since that time. I thought, oh, this is interesting. And he found me because he'd read a book written about our childhood, which was written by another childhood friend who would then become the head of the East German Stasi and was a spy master, known as the man without a face, who had been pursued by NATO for 30 years. Okay, yeah, that'll work. I think we can do something with that. And these things kept coming, and one of my favorites was one day when we were working in Vic's office, And we're tired, we've been talking for a long time, and he said, you mentioned somebody named Svetlana. I've told you the story about Svetlana, right? And, no, I don't think I've heard that one. You know, do we have time? So he starts this amazing story. He says, well, Svetlana was Bukharin's daughter. Bukharin, so Bukharin was Lenin's right-hand man, and he was Stalin's rival to be the ruler of Russia. Yes, yeah, that guy, the one who was the hero of the purge trials and sort of never knuckled under. Yes, okay, well, Bukharin's daughter was another of Vic's high school classmates. And when Bukharin was arrested, the classmates sort of had to rally around her to sort of protect her from what was happening in Moscow as her father was arrested to be in the greatest of all the purge trials in the 1930s. And then after her father was executed in the show trial, Svetlana and her mother were essentially arrested and sent to Siberia. She was released first, went back to Moscow without her mother, didn't know where her mother was, and so set off on this extraordinary journey across Siberia from Gulag to Gulag, looking for her mother, walking along the railroad tracks, walking from camp to camp. The stories are so heartbreaking of these people who were sent from Moscow east on trains, and the only way they could communicate with the outside world would be to write letters and then throw them out the window of the train. I hope that somebody walking along the tracks would find the letter and mail it. And so there was no communication, but finally Svetlana got to a camp and where she found out her mother was in prison. And the camp was, they had people came out of the camp to do logging, cut trees. And so she was able to talk to some of these people in the woods and verify her mother was there. And after one of these trips, they came up with a plan that it told her to be at the gate of the camp at a certain time. And so she was there, and then as the wagon of logs went through the gate, the logs fell off, and the gate was stuck open. And then Svetlana's mother came out, and for a few moments she could see her on the other side of the gate. And so that was the end of her journey, looking for her mother. And so then the mother is finally released years later, a broken woman, and returned to Moscow, and Svetlana essentially spent the rest of her life taking care of her. And then Vic got to reunite with her late in life and hear the whole story and sort of be part of that again. So that was one afternoon sitting in Vic's office hearing this story, which was so powerful and moving, and yet just one little tiny part of this huge epic book. So I was very honored to be part of that, be able to record it, express it, bring it to you, and here's the man himself, Vic Fisher.
One of the great aspects of this process that Charles referred to was the collaboration that we had going. Everything flowed together. We worked together. It was a real partnership. And Charles, just as he told the story, he grabbed sort of these pieces of life and the stories of life, and it helped connect them and make them flow. And as I've told other people, if it hadn't been for Charles, I probably would still be, if I were talking to you, I'd say, one of these days I'm going to write my stories. And anyway, the process was great. I think the result is good. We've had marvelous feedback, and there are stories and stories and stories, and one thing sort of leads to another. As Charles referred to the book written by the general of the Eastern Stasi, State Security Organization, and the reference there is to a book called The Troika, and this is another story. that sort of flows through the whole book about the three boys who connected when they were 10, 11 years old and formed sort of a bond of the Three Musketeers and did everything together. And then it transits, it goes off to my coming to America with help from Eleanor Roosevelt, getting us out of Russia. And then during the war, one of my friends served in the Russian army, fighting on the Eastern Front against the Germans. And the second friend was in the German Hitler army on the Eastern Front. And I was in the American army in France, in Germany, so at the same time. And there was a reconnection after the war, and the last time the three of us came together and visited, they visited me in Alaska. We had previously met in Berlin, and there's a picture in the book where the three of us were on the frozen Arctic Ocean, north of, adjacent to Prudhoe Bay, sort of reliving our lives and remembering how, as kids, we had dreamed of being pioneers in the Siberian Arctic when we grew up. And here we were, many decades later, reunited. One of many, many stories. I would love to keep telling stories, but I don't want to bore those who have read the book, and I assume a few of you might have. And I can't really give the full sweep of life in a capsule, except to tell you about how the title got to be. I often have the question, why is it called To Russia with Love? And then in the last subhead, An Alaskan Journey. And the first To Russia with Love was my parents after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. They were, my mother had been born during Tsarist Russia. She despised the Tsars, the whole oppression of the people. She lived in Switzerland, went to school in Switzerland during World War I. She went to New York, became in the middle of World War I, became a translator, an interpreter after the Soviets came to power after the Bolshevik Revolution. She worked for the Russian Railroad Commission that was buying equipment to rebuild the railroads after the Long War and the Civil War in Russia. She met my father in New York, and they went to Berlin. Through her, he got an introduction to some high-level Russians. They moved to Moscow. They lived in Moscow, and they were enthusiastic about this new experiment, the new dream of equality and a good life in the future of Russia. And there was a lot of privation, but there was hope, always hope in the future, and things started getting better in the 1930s, and then the Stalin era came, and it was just horrendous, and it affected us directly and indirectly, directly in terms of people who were being arrested, executed. Nikolai Bukharin was high in the Communist worked with Lenin, that's sort of a high-level example. But there were people, our neighbors were arrested. We heard the stomp of boots in the middle of the night, after midnight, on the stairs outside our apartment, and the noise of the arrest and the searching and so on. The teachers disappeared, parents of fellow students like Svetlana, and the father of one of my two friends was arrested and executed. Anyway, it was millions and millions and millions of people perished in the 1930s in Russia, and including my friend's father. So he was close. My mother and father decided, my father had left Russia. He wouldn't report on them anymore. He had been specialist writer on Russia, and an American born in Philadelphia with an American passport. And he left in 1936 and wouldn't come back. And my mother applied for an exit permit to leave Russia, to join her father, come to the States, and she was denied. And then she was called out by the KGB and interrogated, and that's described there. Eleanor Roosevelt was contacted by my father, and he had met her before. He went to the White House. She and the president agreed that they would help, and within 2-3 weeks we were out of Russia and so on. There are a lot of stories, and they interweave and they go off here, and I started up. I can talk forever, and that's why Charles was so important in writing this book, because I just go on, and I forget even where it started. I was talking about the threesome, our three musketeers called the Troika, and this Secret Service general has wrote a book about the three kids, our families, what happened, how we came together, and so on. And it was through this book that one of my classmates wrote to me. He saw the book, he recognized me, wrote, and sort of borrowed, and the story opened up another chapter where I reconnected with my classmates. There were reunions. I'm still in touch with the surviving classmates. They're in the late 80s, around 90, and so the stories just go on and on and on. And
You were going to tell them about the reason for the title.
oh, yes, that's where I was. Yes, so my parents became totally disillusioned, but this is why Charles is so important in my life. My parents became totally disillusioned, and the dream was totally killed when Stalin and Hitler signed a non-aggression pact, which eventually led to Germany's attack on Russia, Russia coming into World War II. And then in 80s, latter 80s, under Gorbachev, there was a softening up of the dictatorship in Russia, eventually leading to perestroika, which means sort of change, and relaxation, and a reconnection of the people in Russia and Alaska across the Bering Strait. And I sort of almost naturally, with Brian Rogers helped, I'd long retired from the university. Brian was vice president of the university at the time. Wendy Redmond and urged the president of the university, O'Dowd, to bring me on board, and I became director of Russian affairs in the office of the university president. And we established wonderful connections, people to people, science to science, education to exchange, to education and lots of other training and technical assistance programs. And I spent the next 15, 20 years dealing with Alaska and Russian connections. And those of us who were involved in that effort, it had this wonderful positive feeling that aside from a good person-to-person relation, that we're helping bring democracy to Russia, helping this change and evolution toward a better society. And of course, in Putin came, there was corruption and crime and lots of problems came along. And then Putin took over and brought order to Russia, clamped down on democratic movements, clamped down on contacts between Americans and Russians. And so we had disillusionment, the big difference between the Stalin era and the Putin era, that well, a few people have been, many have been jailed, some have been murdered along the way. Russia today is a paradise compared to the terror days of Stalin. Anyway, that's the parallel to Russia with love. The early pre-Stalin days, pre-Putin days, when we had great enthusiasm, and then that went down. So, do you want to add anything at this point? Okay, does anybody have any questions? We don't have a mic, so if anybody has a comment or questions, please speak up loud. I'm hard of hearing, so be real loud.
Vic, I'd like to hear you say something in Russian, a sentence or a small paragraph or phrase. I'd like to hear it as if you were there talking.
Я очень рад поговорить по-русски, я могу объяснить, что ты хочешь, и я могу целый день, целый вечер здесь об этом разговаривать на русском языке.
Спасибо.
Пожалуйста. The content was nothing, you just want to hear something. Thank you. Thank you for breaking the ice there. Well, the evening's going to be short.
Well, how did you keep from going insane during World War II when you were in the U.S. Army and, Hitler and Stalin? What kept you alive?
Well, what kept me alive, I was an American at that point. I was in the Army. I was a soldier and had various things to do with, but I was in the Army. The focus was very narrow. I had no idea where my two friends were. I knew that one had been in Russia, the other in Germany before the start of the war. There had been no communication once the war started. So the threesome all survived. I had no idea whether they were alive, where they were, what they were doing. My role within the U.S. Army was to just follow orders and do what had to be done. And I was not focused on, I was raised to despise fascists. So the basic motivation in signing up as a volunteer in the U.S. Army was to go fight the fascists, fight to get the right. Stalin, at that point, join the war as an ally. So I was glad that they were fighting, and they're the ones who really took the main initiatives to defeat Hitler. Without him, England would have fallen as France before, and it would have been a different world. I was not thinking about those things. It was do whatever had to be done to finish the war, but strictly as an American soldier. Yes?
One story that you told me that's not in the book was how you dealt with the architect of the Greening Building. Is that story tell?
I was director of what is now the Institute of Social and Economic Research, and we had started with 2 offices in the Duckering building. I think at one point we were in the Nell building. Then there was, and we kept growing very fast. And we were moved off campus on top of the grocery store. What do they call it? College and grocery store. We had the whole second floor of that. That's where the bookstore is now on the first floor. And then plans developed to build a new building, which eventually became the Greening Building. And San Francisco architects were hired to design the building, and they came up to Fairbanks, and they had a form to fill out by the prospective occupiers of this new building. And there were all sorts of questions: how many people we have, what we do, and so on and so forth. And then there were questions about contacts with students, working with other departments. Do we deal with the public? How many hours are quantitative and qualitative aspects of our interaction with different sectors of the universe? And wherever they ask questions like that, I said, we have no interactions with students. We don't work with any other institutes, with any part of the university. That we're off campus now, and we really don't have contacts with the public. And lo and behold, we were assigned the top floor and a half of the Greening Building because we had no contacts with anyone. And that's because I knew how architects function, and that if we had a lot of contacts, we'd be on the ground floor. And this way, we had a good view. We had peace and quiet, I guess we are not there anymore. Gradually, in the middle 1970s, we drifted down to Anchorage, and formally the institute was moved down and headquartered in Anchorage. But it was fine. Yes?
Well, I'm a little too young to have anything other than a faint recollection, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, but I remember it was 1980, you ran for the state senate, and you ran against an incumbent named Bill Sumner, and his campaign manager was a young guy named Jerry Ward, who we all know a lot better in the later years. But if I remember correctly, Sumner and Ward tried to use your background growing up in Eastern Europe against you in a rather jingoistic fashion. Is that correct?
The last sentence.
They tried to use your background growing up in Eastern Europe against you in the campaign in a rather jingoistic fashion.
Yes. In 1980s, your memory is in some ways better than mine. But in 1980, I ran across a guy named Bill Sumner, who was a senator representing downtown Anchorage. And he he essentially was crooked. He was corrupt in many ways. And I was supported to defeat Bill Sumner. And he used, and I ran in 1980 in the August primary. I was unopposed on the Democratic side. He had an opponent on the Republican side that just smushed the guy. However, in the unopposed primary, I still had more total votes than he had in the than there were total votes in the Republican primary. And they had no expectation that he would have any real opposition. The expectation among all the politicos was, oh, Fisher hasn't got a chance against this powerful guy who's got the seniors and the blacks and the various groups he's sucked up to, that he's got them in his camp. And Selma Putman and Nancy Grosek and lots of others supported me. Tim McGinnis, if some of you may know him, did my media work. And anyway, we had sort of a grassroots campaign, and when Sumner and his people just pulled out all the stops, and they used my European background as something to attack me. I had been involved in 79, 80 on a project that Brian Rogers had dealing with the forthcoming constitutional question, shall there be a constitutional convention? And he was head of the joint committee looking at what the pros and cons and what the issues would be in a 1982 referendum. And I was a consultant to the committee for a period, and one of the things that was of interest, what happened in Hawaii, because they had, as I remember, 2 constitutional conventions since statehood. And so I took a trip to Hawaii to visit friends and so on, and interviewed the president of one of the conventions, one of the leading members, and various others about their constitutional convention. And then some of his people took that and they made a radio TV spot with hula dancers and big fishers going to Hawaii and on a vacation funded by the state of Alaska, and so it smeared me completely. And I covered my own expenses. And,
but you said their ads were kind of funny.
Right. It was a very funny ad. And then they also sent out postcards to all the registered voters in the downtown district, again with a picture of hula dancers and Vic Fisher taking vacation on the legislature and so on. And I forget how we responded, but we first said it's a lie, I wasn't an adult and so on. But anyway, they came from all directions, but by then the goose was cooked and I was elected.
I just want to add something to that because one of the things that was really interesting to me was learning about how politics in Alaska has changed from when Vic first got here in 1950. And just to give you, you know, if you think about how we do things now and compare it to what the state was like then, or the territory. Vic got to the United States in 1939, not speaking any English. He got to Alaska only 11 years later, and then was elected to the Constitutional Convention 5 years after that. You know, it's just an extraordinary thing that somebody at that young age, and who was that recently an immigrant, would be trusted with that kind of responsibility. And part of it, I think, was such a new place, right? There weren't that many people of expertise, and also maybe a more accepting place than it is now. And then despite what we know from history about the Red Scare of McCarthyism in the 1950s, a guy who grew up in Russia, learning to admire the leaders of Russia, actually was able to get elected to the Constitutional Convention, then the territorial legislature. So in a lot of ways, a much more open society than it is now.
Yeah, that's very correct. It was an open society where each individual was very much judged on the basis of what he or she could contribute, what he or she was doing, and so on. And I was just very fortunate. I guess it was my style to just get involved. When there's an opportunity, when there's something to do, I get involved. Just as I'm involved in a referendum movement now to cancel the oil tax giveaway the legislature just voted. But my first job that brought me to Alaska was as town planner with the Bureau of Land Management. And I had the opportunity to travel all over Alaska to visit Kodiak and Dillingham and Cordova and Valdez, towns that were all in the South Central District. And at that point, we ran at large for within the 4 major regions of Alaska: Southeast, Central, South Central, and so on. And then I quit that and became Anchorage Planning Director. And everybody in Anchorage got to know me. And so in the meantime, I got involved in the statehood movement. And so I was an activist, and those of us in the statehood movement, many of us ran for the Constitutional Convention. It was just logical part of trying to become a state. And so I was well known at that point, and nobody gave a damn what my background was. They just saw that I was somebody who might make a contribution, and it was elected to the Constitutional Convention. So it was a very different era. It was easy, and you were judged on the basis of what you were. I might mention that it was not just a more open society. The scale was very small. It was easy to get to know people, and they get to know you. When I came to Anchorage, the city of Anchorage had 11,000 people. So compare that to where we are today. The other big difference we had was that when it came to statehood, when it came to the issues related to that, particularly the Constitutional Convention, Alaskans were not totally united, but the majority was overwhelmingly for statehood. Those that were elected to the Constitutional Convention wanted to work together to help Alaska become a state, as well as build a foundation for the future state. And it was the most marvelous civil dialogue. People from different parts of Alaska coming together, getting to know each other, to work together toward the common goal. And it was just about the opposite extreme of what we see in Washington, D.C., what we see in Juneau. in the legislative process where there's division, lack of cooperation, lack of compromise, and so on. Again, I could go on forever. Yeah.
How did your childhood growing up in Russia and coming to the United States, and then eventually to Alaska, how did that impact your participation in the state constitutional convention? By the time you got there, how did that impact how you perceive a state constitution should be written?
I would say, sort of looking back, at the time, it was just a process of getting involved and doing things and so on. And Charles was very good in getting me to be introspective and to analyze questions like that. Sort of what was my motivation, how did it manage, and so on and so forth. I was just one of those who sort of took risks on when something came along, and anyway, I would say that the way I became part of all that evolved and to what I'm doing today is that I'm a believer in democracy. I'm a believer in doing what's best for the people. And I probably picked that up from the pure communist ideals that are very close to original Christianity. Whatever Jesus talked about was what the essentially Bible of the communists was in terms of people to people. You take care of the least successful, the poorest of the poor, and so on. And I was raised in that kind of environment where you're socially active, you believe in some human values, and I was a liberal by just evolution from my parents, from the society around me, sort of the opposition to dictatorship, to Stalinism, and things like that. And Alaska, getting in the Constitutional Convention, provided an opportunity to pursue these values, but I didn't come to the Constitutional Convention with an agenda or with a particular position. I did believe in local self-government, among other things. Just an example where I have worked with local governments in Alaska. I believed in local self-government, in the concept of home rule. We each should have basic rights, and there shouldn't be control from above. And I have bring that into the local government article of the Constitution, so that we have a situation today where Anchorage has a municipal structure that was written and created by the people of Anchorage through a charter commission that was like the Constitutional Convention. My wife Jane was a member of the charter commission and wrote the Constitution for Anchorage. And with the same constitutional provision on the home rule, authorized the creation of a giant North Slope borough that is a very rural, vast region, the largest local government in the United States. It was that kind of expression of a belief in people running their own affairs that sort of involved my involvement in the statesman's movement and in the Constitution. That's about as close as I can define it.
And I'd like to add to that, because we did talk quite a bit about this, is that one of the hallmarks of the Alaska Constitution is we could say extreme optimism about human nature. So this is a Constitution which places maximum power in the generation which is currently alive. It doesn't hold anything back in terms of having dedicated funds or anything that where a past generation could control a future generation. And it also gives a great deal of power to the governor and to the legislature so that they can do whatever is necessary in the time in which they're living. And then Vic talked about the local government part, which again gives maximum power to local people over their own area. I think that comes out partly at the times of a tremendous optimism in the 1950s that people are going to work together and they are going to make this place work. And we don't know what their problems are going to be in the future, but we can count on future generations. And I see a little bit of a parallel between that and the utopianism of the original communist idea that Vic's father was somewhat an adherent of, and his mother of this idea that, well, we just count on people to, you know, have the dictator proletariat and we're all going to work together and have this wonderful society. And so there's a common thing there in terms of this optimism, which, you know, has its positive elements and not so positive. It doesn't always work out, but optimism is at least gives you a chance for good things to happen.
I think this is the last question, right?
Real loud.
Getting close. Many people have asked me over the years why you.
Just my daughter, yeah.
Many people have asked me over the years why you never ran for governor, and it never occurred to me to ask you, so I'm getting around to it now. What do I tell them?
You tell them I never ran for governor because I didn't want to be governor. I'm not the governor type. I think I would hate sitting in an office and having a massive bureaucracy that I'm the head of. And I like moving around and doing different things. I want to be free.
You have to ask Ben, well, governor of what? He was actually governor of Chukotka as well.
Right. That's another story. I was asked to be the governor of Chukotka, which is a province up in Russia, opposite the Suez Peninsula. So, but there too I said no. I think we're about to...
Vic, can I ask one, why did you think that the oil tax, you said it was unconstitutional, so why don't you say a little bit?
Well, I made a categorical statement that what the legislature did in repealing ACES and doing the big tax giveaway was unconstitutional. That's too extreme a term, but we have a specific directive to the legislature to manage Alaska's resources for the benefit of the people of Alaska, people of the state, for the maximum benefit. And it's in terms of that concept, that value being undermined, this concept that underlay the resource article, that I think it is a violation of the constitutional concept of the constitutional values. But in terms of being unconstitutional, that's really up to the Supreme Court of Alaska, and I have a hunch that they would, in line with Charles just said, about leaving the future management of Alaska to the future population. They would say that I think they would say that the convention delegates expressed the value, but in terms of enforcement, if that is the value of the people today, that is constitutional. So it's a violation of a constitutional value and intent, but not unconstitutional. Yes?
You know, there's Jay Hammond, he graduated from U of A with a degree in biology. He was a great wolf hunter up on the North Slope, but and I do like Jay, but the state lost billions of dollars because they didn't put the money into escrow, and they did a settlement with the oil companies. And I was wondering now if they could have some provision, I want your comments on this, put the money into escrow, and after 3 years, those companies that led to increased production up on in the state would get a tax break. The companies that didn't participate would not get it, this new tax law.
Right.
They would go back into the ACES, right? What do you think about that? Because I know this is a controversial bill here, that Senate Bill 21, and
But I think that's a great concept. There were proposals to put a sunset provision, which would say it wasn't quite your idea of the escrow, but to say, okay, this SB 21 goes into effect. But its life is over in 5 years or even 10 years. But then it comes up again for renewal. And if the concept being that if the oil companies have not lived up to their implication that they will increase production and so on, then the tax law would be rewritten. But the governor and the powers that be in the legislature just didn't allow any kind of excursion of just the repeal. And we were just notified yesterday that the lieutenant governor has approved our application for a referendum. The Division of Elections has gone ahead with the printing of petitions, and we've got hundreds of volunteers lined up. And what the referendum would do is repeal SB 21 and go back. The effect of that would be we go back to ACES as it is today. The government hasn't even signed the bill. We go back, and then we can, if we the people manage to stop SB 21, then we can. At that point, there'll be a tremendous message to the next legislature. Here you have a chance to rewrite whatever needs to be done with the existing oil regime as it exists now before SB 21, and put in specifications like that there has to be performance, has to be some proof of investment coming to Alaska. And there are a lot of issues involved in declining oil production. I was just reading an article yesterday that nationally and worldwide investment in oil production is high and growing. The production has been going down. The other forces, somebody said today Charles, you tell me which, about the relationship between oil production and the taxes and investment. Where you were yesterday, David Cole.
Oh, right, yeah. You have a good memory. Oh, well, I was, I do a lot of different writing things. I've just finished helping write a report on national energy policy, which was funded by this oil man in Oklahoma, who went in front of their legislature. I guess he's drilled more gas wells in Oklahoma than anyone else. And they have a big tax credit for drilling gas wells. And he got in front of the legislature and said, I've drilled all these gas wells and I've never drilled one because I got a tax credit. And that's not why you make the decision to drill a well. There's other decisions. Tax credit is nice to have, but his view is that no, that incentive never got you to drill a well.
Well, and one of the things that's been happening in the ACES, there have been a lot of smaller independent oil companies coming into Alaska because of ACES, because of our existing oil tax regime. And it is the small ones, the independents, are doing exploration, looking for new oil. None of the three majors do exploration. We have the giant fields, we have some discovered fields. They work those whenever they want to, at whatever rate they want to. And probably the oil tax regime has nothing to do with how much they invest. However, in the case of what the legislature just did, they probably invested a few $1 million on lobbyists, on TV, and other media, and in exchange for investing a few $1 million, they're going to get billions of dollars without having to do anything that they weren't planning to do anyway. Anyway, that's what I'm involved in. At my age, and I'm 89, will be 99 in a week, so we're still busy. Thank you. Thank you.
So these primary resources and all of our rare and unique items are here for you to study. We encourage everyone to visit the archives on Level 2 to learn more about these treasures firsthand and be inspired as we are. I have some booklets here from our archives, and I'll hand those out if you're interested. But please stop by anytime. There's lots of interesting things there. Dick on tape, amongst other things, telling stories back from 1969. So, anyway, so thank you all for coming.